It's frightening to think how many of us are still prepared to drink and drive despite knowing full well how dangerous it is. And it's a startling fact that many of us are stopped for drink driving the morning after we've been drinking. So how do you know how many units of alcohol you've consumed? And how do you know when you are alcohol free? Drug driving is also a major problem, but it's hard to measure because testing is limited. The Department of Transport, after a 3-year study, found that 18% of people that were killed in road traffic accidents were driving with drugs in their system. Let's find out more from a police officer, Paul Masterton. Paul, what poses the biggest problem then? People driving under the influence of drugs or drink?
They both pose a significant problem for us in different age groups and different categories of driver. Whilst drinking and driving is really the domain of the older driver, some people still hark back to the days when it was almost acceptable to have a drink and drive. Most younger drivers have grown up in an era where it's socially unacceptable. The younger drivers, unfortunately, have grown up within a drugs culture where drugs are almost accepted as a recreational pastime, and that is creeping onto the roads, and many of our younger drivers are driving under the influence of certain illegal substances.
So what are the limits then? What can we drink and drive safely with? What can we consume safely?
There is a real big problem when people ask, what can you drink? The legal limits are 35 micrograms per 100 millilitres of breath. And that doesn't actually make a lot of sense to most people. Most people would have no idea how to correlate that piece of information with what they can drink. There's obviously units of alcohol. Different types of alcohol have different unitary values, and of course there is the physiology of the body, and everybody has a different way of metabolising the alcohol once they've taken it. The only advice I can say if you're going to drive is don't drink. It's the only way you can be 100% sure that you're not going to be over the limit. You quite often hear people say, oh, I can drink 2 pints, and you say, right, you can drink 2 pints perhaps once you've had a large meal, and you drive maybe 4 or 5 hours later. But if you take out the fact that, you know, they've had a decent sized meal, it could be they've got a cold. Their body isn't actually metabolising the alcohol as well as it was. You might not be able to drink that 2 pints. It's a very, very difficult piece of information to actually give to somebody, to say to them, this is what you can and you can't drink, because 2 people could stand next to each other, one could drink a certain amount of alcohol and be perfectly okay to drive. The person standing next to them would be over the limit.
What about drugs? What can we take and drive safely?
Well then, when it comes to drugs, it's even more difficult. There are no set limits in law for drugs. When it comes to drug driving, it is purely down to how they are impaired. So how they're driving has been altered by the fact that they have a substance within their body. And for that, we look at a medical examination of the person to actually determine how impaired they are.
What penalties do we face if we're caught driving under the influence of drugs and alcohol?
Well, for either of those offences, you can straight away look at a 12-month ban. That's standard across the board. Bear in mind, there may be other mitigating factors which could increase that. Were you involved in a collision where someone was seriously injured, or heaven forbid if somebody was actually killed, you could be looking at anything up to 14 years in prison.
The morning after the night before is a really big problem, isn't it?
Certainly for a lot of drivers, the fact they've just put their head down, shut their eyes for a few hours, seems to be that amazing buffer for some people. They think, that's fine, I've had a sleep, I'm fine. Sleep does not affect the metabolism of the alcohol. You've still got to think, I've got to leave myself plenty of time for this alcohol to leave my system, and that is a real big problem. Certainly if you're working shifts and you're starting very early in the morning, don't think the police aren't out there. I mean, and we don't know about this problem because we are very, very aware of the fact that people that travel early in the morning, if they've had a hard night drinking, they're still going to be well over the drink drive limit.
Now, the sort of drugs that none of us would really suspect might be dangerous, the over-the-counter stuff, prescription drugs, things like antihistamines, how dangerous are they in our system?
Well, again, they can be as bad or even worse than some of the drugs we typically associate with drug driving. When somebody says to you, oh, someone was driving under the influence of drugs, everyone immediately thinks, oh, cannabis, heroin, cocaine. But you can walk into just about any pharmacy anywhere across the country and buy drugs which are just as bad. And you've got to be very careful. You've got to read the instructions. You've got to pay attention to those instructions. It's no good reading them and thinking, oh, I'll be okay. If they say don't drive, you really mustn't drive.
So the alcohol that we consume at home can be very misleading. For example, if I asked you, could you drink half a pint of wine? You'd think, no way, half a pint. But if I just take what looks like a fairly ordinary sized glass and pour half a pint in, goodness, that's half a pint of wine. And I could easily drink one of those of an evening. Now, this, to me, looks like a fairly small glass of wine, 75 centilitres, and the wine that's in here is a 14%. So this looks like 1 unit of alcohol for 1 glass of wine, but in fact, it's 2.5 units. Now, what about my friend who comes round for a nice glass of whisky? He's partial to a drop, and I like to be generous, so I've poured him a fairly substantial portion there. But if we were in a pub, a single pub measure of whisky, 25 centilitres. That's 1 single measure, and I've given him this much. And look what I've poured him. That's over 3 times the single measure. Makes you think. Remember, 1 unit of alcohol takes 1 hour for your body to process. Drink and drug driving ruins lives. Taking the decision to drive under the influence of drugs or drink may cost you your licence, your career, your life, or even someone else's.